On the advice of his longtime therapist, a 70-year-old man named Art began writing about what happened to him and his family 30 years earlier in 1989. His therapist only knew Art had lost a child and felt very guilty about it, but the conditions under which the child was lost was always very gray, even though Art had been his patient for years and the therapist had repeatedly tried to get more information. Was this a child that was lost in pregnancy? Was it a child that was born and died or ran away? Those details never emerged, and every time the therapist tried to dig in, Art would back off, close up, and he would not talk about it. And so finally, his therapist said, Art, you just need to find a way to talk about this stuff. If you're not going to talk about it with me, then perhaps you should write it all down in a private journal. It'll be a very cathartic experience, and it might help you get over that guilt you're feeling. So Art reluctantly agrees. He goes home, he gets out a piece of paper, and he begins writing all the details of everything that happened leading up to that day in 1989 and what actually happened on that day in 1989. And when he was done and he had a chance to look at what he had written, he didn't feel better. He felt worse. He felt more guilty. But that's because Art had a secret that the therapist didn't know about. And now that it was out on paper, Art suddenly felt like, you know what, before I die, I have to tell the world what me and my wife did. So in 2019, he took all of those notes that he had written down about what had happened and he posted it to Reddit. This is his confession story. Art's son was very, very troubled. Art would say, if you've seen the movie, We Need to Talk About Kevin, where a couple's son turns out to be a total psychopath, Art says that's a pretty good representation of what home life was like with our son. From the day Art's son was born in 1971, it was like something was off about him. Art and his wife Lisa had planned this pregnancy, and they were ecstatic when their baby boy was welcomed to the world, and they showered him with affection and love and did everything they possibly could to give him a warm, loving environment. But no matter what they did, it just seemed like he was always miserable. Their son cried constantly for the first 13 months of his life. Now, Art and Lisa understood that when you bring a baby home, there's a good chance they're going to cry. But his crying was so constant and he could not be calmed down that they grew concerned that this was more than just a colicky baby, that there could be some underlying issue. And so they brought their son to doctors and specialists, and they tried every treatment under the sun. They changed his diet, they changed his room, they sang him songs, they changed everything they could, but it never stopped. And so 13 months of grinding, grating, no sleep time. Finally, in the 14th month of his life, he seemed to get over the incessant crying stage, and Art and Lisa were so relieved. It seemed like finally they could just be loving parents and not be so frustrated with their child all the time. But it seemed like now that he wasn't crying, he still was just totally unhappy. His body language and everything about him said, I'm not happy. Always. Art said that he never saw his son ever have a genuine, joyous smile. The only time he saw something resembling a smile was when his son would grin after causing someone pain or breaking a rule or in some way being bad. And then once his son started walking, all he wanted to do was just destroy everything in front of him. But again, Art and Lisa, they realized that this is all pretty typical child behavior, albeit maybe on the more extreme end of bad behavior, but it's still in the realm of normal child. And they're thinking that they are the reason this is happening. And so they're not blaming their son at this point. They're still doing everything they can to take care of him and love him to the best of their ability. When their son was about 2 years old, he learned how to take off his diaper, and he began sneaking around the house and emptying the contents of his diaper into corners of the house, underneath carpets, grinding it into the carpet, smearing it on the walls. But again, Art and Lisa are looking inward and saying, our child is only 2 years old. It can't be his fault he's acting this way. It's our fault for not finding a way to correct this behavior. But Art and Lisa started to drift away from that opinion when their son got a little bit older, got potty trained, and wasn't using diapers anymore, and still was going around the house and squatting down and going to the bathroom all over the house, making a mess at every possible chance he could. And not just when he was 4, 5, 6 years old. All the way up until he was 15 years old, he was doing this. And he stopped doing it in random corners, and he began only going into his parents' bedroom every chance he got, opening up the sheets, going inside, going to the bathroom, shutting it back up, and leaving. It got to the point where Art and Lisa literally could not stop their son from doing this. He was absolutely determined to do this. So anytime they were away, he would even sneak in the windows to do this. I mean, he was totally hell-bent on going to the bathroom in their bed. And so they had to start putting locks on the windows and the doors of their bedroom. But when they had finally secured that room to where he really couldn't get in anymore, he began going to the bathroom right outside their door and in the other beds in the house. And so they began investing in locks on all of the doors. They even replaced the doors themselves because they were too flimsy, and they thought there's a good chance he might kick these doors in to try to get them open. So they put these big, thick doors up all through their house and put these big locks with key locks all over the house to keep their son from going in and going to the bathroom all over their bed sheets. As their son grew older, he became more and more unmanageable, well beyond just going to the bathroom in different places. He became violent, and he would bite and kick and scratch and spit on anybody that came near him. He was like a wild animal. Before he was 9 years old, he had been kicked out of school 2 separate times. When they let him back in a 3rd time, he apparently did something that was so bad that they effectively expelled him. A 9-year-old is getting expelled from school. So they had to enroll him at this other special school that would accept him with his history. But part of the deal with this school is you don't have any interaction with other students. He was considered too dangerous to be around other kids. So he was totally isolated at school, and it ultimately made him a lot worse. Once he was enrolled in this school, he became really violent at home. He would come home from school and he would go right to the kitchen and get a knife out, and he would start threatening his parents, to the point where they had to lock all the drawers in the kitchen. Once all of the knives were under lock and key in Art's house, his son began stealing knives from the neighbor's house, smuggling them back into the house, and at night he would pull them out and try to stab Art. And on 2 different occasions, he was successful, and Art still has scars on his leg from it. And Art's son was not just attacking his parents. He was also turning on local animals that were helpless. He blinded one of the local dogs that was running around the area by just stabbing it in the eye one day. He went after one of the stray cats and he lit its tail on fire. And honestly, Art doesn't even know the other damages he had done to other animals or even other people. Even though Art and Lisa massively resented their son for how badly he treated them and how difficult he was making their lives, they recognized that this was a child that needed help. And so they tried everything they could to help him by enrolling him in that special school that ultimately was isolating, but it was an attempt to try to help him, or bringing him to different therapists and psychologists and doctors, putting him on different medications and bringing him to meditation consultants. I mean, you name it, they tried everything they could to try to help this kid, but nothing worked. He only got angrier and angrier and got bigger and stronger and more aggressive and violent. And eventually Art and Lisa are like, what do we do about this? What ultimately started happening over the following years is Art and Lisa became prisoners of their own home, that every time their son was around, they felt unsafe around him. He was such a wild card, and he had these crazy angry outbursts, and he was clearly prone to extreme violence. And so they began using those heavy doors and locks to lock themselves away from their son. It was the only way they felt safe. And so with that in mind, fast forward to 1988, when Art's son is now 16 years old, and Art and Lisa find out they're pregnant again. It was a surprise, and they were not happy about it. In fact, because of how badly it had gone with their son, they were really scared that another child was going to be just as bad, and they couldn't possibly go through this again. And so they decided that they weren't going to terminate, but if they noticed early on this child was a huge problem child, as horrible as they felt about it, they knew they would give it up for adoption. They simply couldn't do this again. This time they had a daughter, and she was normal. She was nothing like their son. She didn't come home and cry constantly. She smiled and laughed, and after a few months she was sleeping through the night, and she was hitting her milestones, and she just seemed happy, and she was easy. And it was around this time that Art and Lisa began to realize just how bad their son was. Seeing how wonderful their daughter was just amplified all of their son's atrocious behavior over the first 16 years of his life. And so Art and Lisa really began to look at their son as more of a lost cause. And they were less invested in going through the motions to try to find some way to help him when they knew it wasn't going to work. It had never worked. And he's only a couple years away from being 18, and he can go out on his own and figure it out for himself. And now, since they didn't really care as much about him, suddenly his behavior was intolerable. And anytime he acted up, they would never lay a hand on him, but they were not afraid to tell him to basically get the F out of here. We are not putting up with this. leave. And so regularly, Art and Lisa would have these horrific screaming matches with their son until their son would basically run away in a rage and then come back hours later or even a couple days later. And Art said he began to look forward to fighting with his son because every time they fought, it meant his son would be gone for a little while afterwards and there would be a little bit of peace and calm inside the house. But at the same time, Art and Lisa were concerned one of these days he's going to come back in after one of these fights and he's going to kill us. So it went on like this for about a year until a rainy day in 1989 when their son was almost 18 and their daughter was almost 1 year old. Now the house they lived in was a single-story bungalow and their daughter's room was against a sidewall where there was a window leading to the outside. That morning, Art and Lisa had got into one of the worst screaming matches with their son they had ever had, and he left in a rage and they slammed and locked the door behind him. After a couple of hours, their son is still gone and they don't expect to see him anytime soon, and their daughter is starting to get fussy. She seems tired, and so they walk into her bedroom, they put her in her crib for a nap, and then Art and Lisa leave her room, shut the door behind them, and go sit down in the kitchen. A couple minutes later, they hear their daughter screaming at the top of her lungs, and Art and Lisa immediately recognize this is not an ordinary cry. This sounds like something is terribly wrong. They get up and sprint down the hall to her room, and they try the door handle, but it's locked. They run back out to the kitchen, they get the keys, they go back, they're fumbling with the keys, they finally open it up, and there in the back of the room, standing next to the crib, is their son. And he's holding a knife, and he's poking it into her face. And Art said he looked at his daughter, and he could see blood on her stomach and blood on her arm, and she's screaming, and so he thinks to himself, thank God she's still alive. And instinctively, Art starts running to try to put himself between his son and his daughter. But before he could even get there, his wife had moved much faster, and she charged over and smashes her son's hand. The knife falls to the ground. She pushes him as hard as she possibly can, and he goes slamming into the wall and falls on the ground. Art immediately reaches into the crib, picks his daughter up, and runs to the other side of the room. And he kind of looks her over. She's crying, she's in pain, she's scared, but he can see the cuts on her are superficial. He turns back around and he can see his wife is standing there with her fist balled, standing in front of her son. Her son stands up and he's looking at her, no emotion on his face. Art would even say that it was like he was looking at an alien. This person wasn't human. How could they do this to their own sister, to a baby? And he stared at him, and then he noticed his wife was moving towards her son like she was going to attack him. And this is where Art says he knew he was supposed to go over there and stop whatever was about to happen. But he didn't. And this is the part of the story where Art reveals his wife, she's this amazing boxer, and he knew that she could beat the living crap out of just about anybody. The son is so stunned by how quickly this has happened that he's not doing anything. He's not positioning himself to fight back or to even preemptively attack his mother. He's just kind of standing there looking at his mother with no expression on his face. And that's when Art's wife winds up and blasts him across the face, knocking his head back, and Art said immediately he could tell his nose was broken, blood squirts all over his face, and he falls to the ground. Until this moment, neither Lisa nor Art had ever laid a hand on their son. Even when he stabbed Art twice in the legs, they never physically struck their son. But this was different. Their son had crossed the line and he could never come back. And so even though Art knew if he doesn't step in, his wife is going to beat their son to death, even though he knew that was going to happen, he remembers thinking, good. He turns around and he leaves the room with his daughter. As Art cleans up his daughter and puts band-aids on each of the cuts that were inflicted on her, he hears in the other room his son is yelling and screaming at their mother saying, I'm going to kill you. And she is just ruthlessly punching, kicking, and smashing him. It is not slowing down at all. And Art remembers by the time he picked his daughter back up after putting all her band-aids on and she'd kind of calmed down, he still heard his wife punching, kicking, and smashing their son, who's now unconscious. Again, Art knows if I don't go in there now, my unconscious son is getting his head kicked in by his mother. If I don't go in there now, he's gonna die, for sure. But Art wants that to happen, so he doesn't go in there. Instead, he just rocks his daughter until she falls asleep, and by the time she's snoring in his arms, his wife is still punching, kicking, and smashing their son, who hasn't made a sound in a long time. Art just sits down at the kitchen table, hoists his daughter onto his shoulder, and just listens for his wife to finish what she's doing. And finally it does go quiet in there, and his wife emerges from the room, and she's covered in blood. Her hands are swollen and red, and her chest is heaving like she's been running a race. She comes into the kitchen and sits down at the table next to Art and looks at him, and he looks back at her, and he just says, "Is he dead?" And she says, "I hope so." And he just goes, "Yeah, me too." Art and Lisa sat at the kitchen table for a long time. There was no sound coming from the room where their son was. And eventually Lisa starts crying and goes and takes a shower. At which point Art stands up and he goes into the bedroom where his son was. And this is when he can tell his son is actually still alive. He walks in and he can see his son still breathing, but he's covered in blood. He's got vomit on him. He's clearly wet his pants. His teeth have been knocked out. His whole face is bloodied and bruised and swollen. And he goes up to him and he thinks there's no way he's going to live through this. But Art has kind of an internal crisis because he wants him to die. He doesn't want him to live. And so that decision of should I call an ambulance or should I call police was a really difficult one to make because really neither served the purpose that he or his wife wanted. And so as he's standing there wondering what to do, he hears his wife come out of the shower. And so he leaves the room and he confers with his wife and they decide, we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call an ambulance. We're going to do nothing. And so right then and there, they walked around their house, they gathered up a couple things, and they headed downstairs into the basement where they had an in-law suite, which basically was a little apartment that they didn't really use, but it had everything they needed. And they moved down there and they locked the one door that led down there and they locked the side door as well. They figured if he lived, there would be enough food to get him through a few weeks upstairs. There's water up there, bedrooms, bathrooms. He had all of that. And at some point he would run out of food and he would have to leave. Or he would die upstairs, and in a couple weeks, they would go up and they would deal with it. Over the next week, they began to hear movement upstairs, which signaled to them he was alive, but he wasn't moving around much. It was just enough to know somebody was up there. They figured that, okay, he's probably laying down most of the time recovering. And so Art began going back to work. He would go out the side door, and every time he went outside and he was on the driveway, he was expecting his son to come out and attack him, but he never did. And his wife, Lisa, she stayed with their daughter 24/7, stayed in the house, and at no point did the son ever try to come downstairs and try to attack her or them at any point. Probably because he was afraid of his mother. About 3 weeks after the attack, they were in bed in the basement and they heard him going absolutely ballistic upstairs, screaming, punching walls, breaking things. And they decided, you know what, whatever he does up there, it's not worth going up there and confronting him. Let him do whatever he wants. And then the next day, it was totally quiet. And for the next couple of days, Art and Lisa would listen really intently to see if they could hear him moving around upstairs, but they couldn't. And so finally, Art and Lisa decide to go up into the main floor and see if he's up there. When they open the door, they find their entire upstairs has been absolutely wrecked. Every piece of furniture is ruined, every window's broken, there's glass all over the place, there's brown smears all over the walls. But their son isn't there. And so they figured that night when they heard him going crazy upstairs, he already knew he was going to leave. He just wanted to ruin their house before he did. Even though their son was gone, they had no idea if he was going to come back or not. And so for days and weeks and months, they lived in fear that their son was just going to show up one day and kill them. But he never did. And then 3 years after the incident, they moved and they weren't in contact with their son. They hadn't seen him. And so he had no idea where they were going and they have no way to contact him. So that was it. They just restarted somewhere else. Fast forward to 2019 when Art is making this Reddit post and he says, I haven't seen my son since 1989 and I don't want to see him again. And Art goes on to say that while he hopes his son was able to overcome his demons and live a normal life, he said if he wasn't able to do that, if he was out there still causing pain and misery to other people, Art says he hopes that whoever was on the receiving end of that finished the job and killed him. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. What's the timestamp? And if you're the first one to do that accurately, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please deliver a strange, dark, or mysterious story to the like button, but in PDF format. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. In 1978, a 9-year-old girl named Kim was walking to the corner store to get some pasta sauce for her mother. On her walk home, a man she had never met before walks up behind her and speeds up to where he's walking in step with her. And he looks at her and introduces himself and says, "Hi, I'm Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" And Kim immediately had a bad vibe about this Dr. Ramsey character. There was just something odd about him. The fact that he had approached her so suddenly and was right on top of her. So her reaction was to not answer his questions and instead put her head down and walk even faster because she knows she's almost at her house. She's almost at safety, and if she can just get there, she doesn't have to deal with this strange man. But as she sped up, so too did Dr. Ramsey, staying in step with her, and he begins peppering her with additional questions and comments. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you?" "Of course they are. You're a big girl now. How old are you? What's your name? Your hair is so beautiful. Where do you live?" When Kim got to be about 10 meters away from her house, she just takes off running, and she bolts up her back steps through the kitchen door into her house, slams the door behind her, and for a few seconds, she just stands there, almost anticipating hearing this Dr. Ramsey guy come up the back steps behind her. But he doesn't, and after a couple of minutes, she pokes her head around and looks out the window, and he's not there anymore. And she feels completely relieved that that weird guy is now gone, and she can just forget about it. But it turns out she couldn't just forget about this, because Dr. Ramsey was not going away anytime soon. It wasn't long after this first initial interaction with Dr. Ramsey that Kim was home one day, and she happened to be looking out her front window to the road, and she sees a blue Ford Galaxy drive slowly by their property. And she's looking at the car and she can tell immediately that the person driving it is Dr. Ramsey. But Dr. Ramsey doesn't see her. She's kind of obscured behind curtains on the window, and she's watching him, and he was looking at their front door and he was waving as if there was someone standing on their front steps, but Kim knew there wasn't. And so he bizarrely just drove the rest of the way past their property, waving the whole time, and then drove off. Now at this point, Kim has not told her mom or her dad or her siblings about Dr. Ramsey, because that first interaction, she kind of chalked it up to maybe her being paranoid and maybe even being a little bit rude that she ran away from this doctor who was just trying to talk to her. But now that she's seen him drive past her house and he's acting strange, her alarm bells are starting to go off. But she doesn't tell her parents quite yet. But the next day when Kim was playing outside, a car drove by and she turned to look at it, and it was the blue Ford Galaxy, and who was driving? Dr. Ramsey. And he slows down and he waves to her and he smiles at her as he passes by, and she kind of looks at him like, "What are you doing?" At this point, Kim knows he's acting inappropriately. Whatever his angle is, it just didn't feel right. So she runs inside and she explains to her mom that when she went to the store to get that pasta sauce on her way back, this strange man, Dr. Ramsey, approached her. She came back to the house. Now I've seen him twice outside of our property and he's clearly waving at me. There's something wrong with this guy. Kim's mother reacted to this news the way most of us would, which is, you're talking about a doctor in this nice neighborhood who's driving down the road saying hi to my kid, and he claims he's a pediatrician. Like, that's a child's doctor. It makes sense he might be waving to kids. That's part of his job, talking and interacting with kids. And so her mother says this can't be a big deal. I'm sure he just works in the area and this is part of his commute going down this road, and now you've seen him a couple days in a row. It's just a coincidence. But shortly after this, when Dr. Ramsey started calling their house, Kim's mother and father very quickly ditched the "he's a doctor so we can trust him" routine and became very concerned. A couple of days after Kim had told her mother about Dr. Ramsey, Kim gets called into the living room where her father's sitting, and he looks very troubled. And he calls her over and has her sit down, and he says, "You're not in trouble. I just need you to talk me through exactly what happened when Dr. Ramsey approached you. Your mother told me about it, and there's been a couple weird things that have happened here, and I just got to hear the story from you." And so Kim goes through the story. She describes how she was leaving the store. He just kind of showed up, and Kim did not talk to him. She put her head down and basically ran back to the house, and that was it. Kim's father reacts to this like he's totally perplexed about something, that he's hearing the facts, but they don't make any sense. And he says to Kim, "Are you sure you didn't say anything to him?" And Kim said, "No, I was scared. I didn't say anything." And Kim's father's like, "Then how did he know your name?" Kim was like, "What do you mean?" And her father said, "Well, just the other day, I got a phone call from someone saying they were Dr. Ramsey, and they asked to speak with you, Kim, by name. They said, 'Can I speak to Kim?' And I thought that was odd because, you're my child." And I said, "Well, why do you need to speak to my daughter? Why can't you speak to me? I'm her father. You're a doctor, you can speak to me." And they hung up. And then they called back again, and they asked for you by name again, as if they hadn't heard me the first time. And so I said again, "Why do you need to talk to my daughter? You can just talk to me. I'm her parent." at which time they hung up again. And so I wanted to hear from you directly if you had given your name to him, because the fact that he knew your name on that call seems really odd to me. Kim assured her father that she did not give him her name. And you got to remember that this is back in 1978, so Dr. Ramsey would not have been able to use the internet to try to find Kim's name, nor would Kim's name have been listed in a telephone book because she was a minor. It would have been her father or her mother that was listed in the telephone book. So in order for Dr. Ramsey to have her name, he would need to know someone that would give up her name or do some digging, which is obviously very creepy considering the fact that Kim has never met him before. He's a strange older man and she's a 9-year-old girl. So with that in mind, Kim and her parents are on edge about this Dr. Ramsey character, but they don't have any clear recourse because he didn't do anything that was criminal. They couldn't go to the police and say he figured out our daughter's name, because they would be saying a doctor, a pediatrician no less, knows our child's name and was waving and smiling at her. But shortly after this, Dr. Ramsey's behavior would take a dark turn. He would call Kim's house again just a couple of days after those first two calls, and Kim's father would answer, and right away, Dr. Ramsey says, "I need to talk to Kim." And Kim's father goes into protective mode and he says, "Do not call this house again," and he hangs up. But seconds later, the phone is ringing again, and at this point, the family has come in the room because they heard their father screaming at someone on the phone. The phone's ringing, and their father picks the phone up and puts it back in the receiver, canceling the call. And he looks at his family and he says, "Do not answer the phone." The phone rings again. He picks it up and cancels it again. On and on, the phone rang incessantly all night until they disconnected the phone line. The next day, when they plugged the phones back in, Kim's parents told all of the kids, "Do not answer the phone. No matter what, don't answer the phone." And once again, the phone starts ringing and Kim's father picks it up. He doesn't say anything. And he hears on the other end of the line, Dr. Ramsey asking for Kim. And he says, "Do not call this house again." And he slams it, thinking that's going to do it. But of course it doesn't. And over the next several days, anytime the phone was plugged in, it was practically a nonstop call from Dr. Ramsey. And one time when Kim's father did pick up the phone, he reacted to it like it was some horrible thing being told to him. And he put it down, he disconnected the phone, and he went into the kitchen. And one of Kim's brothers overhears their father talking to their mother in a hushed tone, and he's saying to her, "He just told me he's going to hurt Kim unless he can speak to her." After this threat was made, things got very complicated. Back in the 1970s, there weren't any stalking laws that would protect Kim and her family from Dr. Ramsey. Even though Dr. Ramsey had just threatened Kim, there was no proof he had done that, and he hadn't done anything physical, and so there wasn't any legal recourse. The police couldn't really do anything. And so Kim's father ends up calling one of his friends who happens to be a police officer. He explains the situation and he says, "Would you mind for the next little bit just escorting my daughter Kim to and from school, because we don't want her to be out walking around by herself with this guy rolling around the neighborhood." The friend says yes, and he began bringing Kim to and from school. And Kim felt a lot safer with her father's friend because you have this police officer that's walking around with you. But it also isolated Kim in a really major way. She wasn't really allowed to go outside anymore without an escort, which meant her life was confined largely to being inside almost 24/7. And there was no clear resolution in sight for how to handle Dr. Ramsey. And so it was like this indefinite period of time that Kim was just not going to be allowed to have a normal life. Once Dr. Ramsey was completely cut off from any interaction with Kim, I mean, she barely went outside, and when she did, she was with this police escort, and she never answered the phone. Once that was going on, Dr. Ramsey became desperate. One evening, Kim, her sister, two of her brothers, and her mother were in the kitchen chatting when one of her brothers suddenly reacts like he sees something out the back window that leads out to their garage. And he runs over and he's looking out, and Kim and her family are turning to him saying, "What do you see? What's going on?" And he goes, "There's someone in the garage." And they all run to the windows and they're looking out, and there's a window on the side of their garage. Their garage was detached from their house. And there's a window on the side, and there was this man there standing there looking out at them. And once he saw that everybody is looking at him, he ducked his head down. And as Kim's family is looking at each other like, did we really just see someone in the window? Because it's kind of dark and they're not there anymore. Suddenly, the garage door slowly rises up, and out pops a man who stands up, looks at them just long enough that Kim yells, "That's Dr. Ramsey, I saw him, that's Dr. Ramsey." And then the guy takes off down the driveway away from their house. And Kim's two brothers immediately run out the house and chase him down the road, but eventually he darts into another property and he disappears and they can't find him. Kim's mother calls the police, they show up, they take down some statements, and they basically say, "Look, if he comes back, let us know, but for now, just go back in your house and lock the doors and keep an eye out." For 2 weeks after the garage incident, they didn't hear from Dr. Ramsey and they didn't see Dr. Ramsey, and it was this great reprieve from this very stressful time in their lives. But after those 2 weeks, Kim's father walked outside onto their front porch and he saw their beloved German Shepherd was dead lying off the side of the porch. And he goes over to the dog and it looks like it's been roughed up, but it's hard to tell what actually happened to it. Now, at first, the family is absolutely devastated about the loss of their beloved animal. But shortly after that, they start thinking, do you think Dr. Ramsey could have had something to do with the death of our dog? And so Kim's father calls the police and says, I think our stalker, Dr. Ramsey, killed our dog. But the police would say there was no evidence to suggest anybody killed your dog. It could have just been an accident. Also, we haven't even been able to identify who this Dr. Ramsey person is because there are no Dr. Ramseys in this town. And so probably he's using a fake name. So the family's sad and frustrated, but once again has nothing they can do about this. That night, Kim and her family are sitting at home. They're all very sad about the loss of their dog, and the phone rings. Now, prior to this, there had been 2 weeks where Dr. Ramsey hadn't called once. And so Kim's father picks the phone up and says, hello? And it's Dr. Ramsey. But unlike all the other calls where Dr. Ramsey almost always began with put Kim on the phone, this time he started with, there are 7 people in your house right now. Your wife's in the kitchen, you're in the living room, your 3 sons are watching TV in the den, and your 2 daughters are upstairs in their respective bedrooms. Kim's father is obviously horrified to hear this because it was all accurate, and he just screams into the phone, stay away from my family, and he hangs up. After this phone call, Kim's father was naturally very shaken up by this because even though they knew Dr. Ramsey was probably living in the area and he clearly drove past the property and was local, it just felt way more intimate for him to be naming things that meant he had to have been near their house recently and looking in windows. And so Kim's father runs around the house and makes sure all windows are shut and locked, blinds drawn, all the doors are locked, and then he goes all around the house to make sure all his kids and his wife and everybody's okay. And then afterwards, he considered calling the police, but felt like it was kind of futile because to this point, they haven't been able to help them and nothing has changed. It was just another creepy phone call. And so they don't do anything. The next day, they plugged their phone line back in because they need to use a phone, and shortly thereafter, the daily calls with Dr. Ramsey began again. And now, every call, whenever they did pick up, started with Dr. Ramsey identifying who was in the house and where they were. After a couple of days of this, the family was just living in paranoia. It was this horrible time in their lives, and one night, the phone rings, and Kim's father picks it up, ready to just scream at this guy and take out his frustrations, and Dr. Ramsey, instead of giving the report, starts by saying, I can open your kitchen window and I can open your French doors to the side of your house. Kim's father is about to yell at him, but instead just hangs the phone up and runs into the kitchen and he checks the window and he knows it's faulty. And clearly, so does Dr. Ramsey. And so he gets a piece of twine and he ties it over the latch and gets it as tight as he can. And then he ran over to the French doors, which were faulty. You'd have to push pretty hard, but you could, in theory, pop the doors open if you knew these were faulty doors. And so Kim's father is not taking any chances, and he gets some nails out of the junk drawer and he nails a row of nails into the ground, right into the hardwood, sitting immediately outside the frame of the door. So if you were to push on them, you would just butt up against the heads of these nails and it would keep it shut. It was his temporary solution until he ordered a proper lock to fit on the door. At this point, it was safe to say Kim and her family were living in fear that Dr. Ramsey at any given point could just break into their house, because clearly he was canvassing their house and testing different entry points, and he had already found 2. And so now they just felt totally unsafe in their house. But oddly enough, after that last call where Dr. Ramsey had said he knew the kitchen and the doors were faulty, the calls from Dr. Ramsey decreased to almost 0, and they didn't see him anywhere, and it started to feel like maybe he had gotten his thrills and he was moving on now. And it just so happened that around the time the family is starting to think this could be over, the mother and father had to go to this company function where the kids couldn't go. So the kids would be alone, but the kids said, we're fine with it. We have each other. The house will be locked. We won't go anywhere. And the parents, even though they hated the idea of their kids being alone at all, because of everything going on with Dr. Ramsey, they felt like, it does seem like he's kind of moved on and we're only going to be gone for a couple of hours, so I'm sure this is going to be fine. So that night, after her parents leave, Kim is sitting on the couch, she's watching TV, her younger brother is laying on the ground right in front of her, and her sister is sitting on the other end of the couch and she's on the phone. And Kim said she found herself looking out of her room into the kitchen towards the side of the house where those French doors were that led out into the side yard, and those doors were still only secured by the nails her father had put into the ground. The lock her father had ordered had not come in yet. Kim found herself looking at these doors, feeling really uneasy about it. And then as she was looking at it, she could have sworn she saw the doors begin to push open. And she's looking at it even more closely. And then for sure, she sees the doors bow inward like someone is pushing on the top and the nails are stopping the bottom. And for a split second, she sees the clear silhouette of Dr. Ramsey. And she screams. It wakes up her sister and her brother, and she's pointing at the double doors. They all look. And once again, he pushes on those doors, exposing himself just for a second to the kids. So now all three kids have now seen this guy trying to force his way into their house. And so they scream and run right upstairs. They go into Kim's room, they shut the door, lock it, turn the lights off, and they go over to the window that's looking out to the front of their house. Now, Dr. Ramsey is on the side of the house, so they wouldn't be able to see him through this window, but they're just praying that he does not break through those doors and come in the house. They're hoping they'll see him as he exits the front of their house. And they're kind of keeping an eye out the window, just praying they see this guy leave their property and leave them alone, but they don't see him leave, and they don't hear any noise downstairs or outside. It's just total silence. And they're wondering, did he already get in the house? They decide they need to look for themselves. And so they leave Kim's room and they sneak down the hall to the side room, which was their brother's room, that overlooked the area where Dr. Ramsey would be. They go over to the window and they poke their heads up and look out the window downstairs. And sure enough, there's a man standing right in front of those French doors with his hands on them, kind of looking in, looking around. And at this point, the kids suck themselves down underneath the window so that he doesn't see them. And as they're crouched down, they hear him start banging on the door downstairs, at which point Kim's sister, who was there with her, just says, "What do you want?" The banging stops and the man says, "I have a pizza. Come down and get it." Kim and her siblings didn't order a pizza, so they just yell out, "If you don't leave, we're going to call the cops." And then Kim pokes her head over the window and she looks down and she can clearly see it's Dr. Ramsey, who's now turned and he's running away from their house. Just a couple of minutes later, Kim's two older brothers return. They were out at a skating rink and they come back, they come inside, and Kim and her two younger siblings go up and tell them what happened. And immediately those two run out and start looking for him, but he's long gone by now. So they come back in, they shut all the doors, they lock everything, they shut the blinds, and they say, okay, all we can do is just get a knife out of the kitchen, each of us, and just be armed until our parents come back. And so they all grab a knife, except for the youngest brother, and they all retreated to their rooms and basically just waited for their parents to come home. An hour later, Kim's parents are still gone and all the kids are still in their rooms, and her younger brother gets hungry and he decides to go down to the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. So he goes downstairs and he's getting his cereal together and he starts feeling like someone is watching him. And he's looking around and he knows all the curtains have been drawn and everything's locked and shut and he's just psyching himself out. But he notices the French doors that are leading to the side of the house. Those have glass panes on them and there's nothing covering them. And so as he's getting his cereal together, he finds himself constantly looking over at this door. And finally he decides, okay, I'm gonna put my cereal down and just go look out the glass, just make sure no one's there. And so he walks a little bit closer to these doors and he gets about, 5-6 feet away, and the glare from the lights above still make it impossible to look out this glass. And so he's kind of squinting his eyes, but he can't see anything. And so he steps forward and he puts his hands like this and he looks right out one of the panes of glass, and staring back at him is Dr. Ramsey, who's probably been there the whole time. And he's just standing there looking at him and he freaks out. He screams for his brothers. And as soon as he turns back around, Dr. Ramsey has run away. He's gone. All of the siblings come pouring downstairs, knives in hand, and they're asking what's going on. And the youngest brother is trying to explain that he just saw Dr. Ramsey right on the other side of this door. And the older brothers go running outside. They're screaming for this guy. They're looking for him, but he's gone. And they all come back in the house and they don't know what to do. And so they all stay up together in the kitchen with their knives, with everything shut and locked, just waiting for their parents to come back. And shortly after, they hear their parents using their keys to come in the house. They come in and the kids explain what happened to their parents, and the parents feel horrible. And they're like, I'm so sorry that we left. We should never have left you guys. But as horrible as this was for the family, when they call the police, they can't really do anything because he wasn't there now. Nobody got hurt. Nothing was taken. And they don't even know what this guy's name is. And so they just said, stay inside, keep everything locked, and let us know if he comes back. A couple of horrible weeks for this family goes by where they're living in constant fear. The parents are never away from their kids. The father had to take time off from work. It's just this very stressful time where they are totally prisoners in their own home. And after about 2 weeks of this, Kim is at school. She's at recess with her class outside, and she was playing on the playground when she looks out at the road and she sees Dr. Ramsey in his car parked waving at her and yelling her name. And so Kim is horrified. She turns and runs to her teacher and she points at him and she says, "That guy's stalking our family. I have to go inside and tell my parents." They immediately took this very seriously. They took Kim inside to the principal's office and they called home to Kim's mom. And when she picks up, Kim's mom explains that she just got a call from the school office asking her to verify whether her husband was going to be picking up Kim from school early. And Kim's mom said, "No, he's not picking her up. There's no one picking her up early." And that's when they put it together that Dr. Ramsey must have been in touch with the school to try to convince them that he was Kim's father and he was here to pick her up. And that's why he was parked outside. Kim's mother is horrified because she's thinking to herself, if the school hadn't been diligent to confirm this, there's a chance they would have given her child to Dr. Ramsey. This proved to be kind of like the final straw. Even though there was a whole bunch of final straws along the way, this was the one that ultimately pushed Kim's father over the edge. That night, Kim was sleeping in bed when she woke up because she was thirsty, and she goes downstairs to the kitchen, and she's surprised to find her father is sitting at the kitchen table, the lights are off, and he's got a gun in front of him, and he looks totally disheveled and upset, and she knows right away that this is because of Dr. Ramsey. She's not thinking this is anything else, and so she walks over to the sink and just kind of ignores the fact that this is happening. She gets a sip of water, and then she sits down with her father and says, "Is everything okay?" And her father looks up and he just says, "No, I'm not okay. I'm tired of leaving the house and wondering if when I come home, my family's not going to be there anymore. I'm tired of not being able to protect my own kids. I'm tired of this. This has to end." Kim didn't know what to say, so she just sat there in silence with her father until he told her to go back to bed. Kim says after this night, they never heard from Dr. Ramsey again. It was like he vanished off the face of the earth. No more phone calls, no more drive-bys, no more anything. He was just gone. And while we don't know for sure what happened to Dr. Ramsey, I think it's safe to assume that Kim's father had something to do with it. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where it's located in the video, what the timestamp is. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please hire someone on Upwork to print out the final picture of Lawana the Bloodthirster and have them fold that up, put it in a birthday card, and mail it to the like button. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our 3, 4, even 5 weekly uploads. In 2003, Kevin Mannis owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop, and it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it, and he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on Lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the contents of Lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car, and as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin in his head went right back to his childhood, because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks, because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks, and so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it." And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these little doors that swing open on the front, and then on the bottom there's a drawer that comes out, and there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Why can't you open it?" And the woman just says, "We never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk, and so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box. Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away, and he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front two doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks of hair. There was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it. And there was also a small wine goblet that was inside, and that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake, and these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens, this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops. And she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space. So she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. the phone rings down there and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality. And she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over, the sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her and she turns around, and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up, and to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident. And now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it, and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away, and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up, and it's Jane, and he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things. And Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, well, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. And he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor, there's no damage anywhere, and he yells for Jane, there's no answer from Jane, and he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back, and he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore, and he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is, and she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you got to tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was going to have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's going to take a flashlight and he's going to explore the basement because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time, he's thinking to himself, you know, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through, because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves. And she doesn't say another word to him, and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh well. He was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop, and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box and he sets it down on a table right in front of his mother, who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it, and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store, and he was expecting a call, and he goes, hold on mom, I gotta get this. And he goes to the back of the store to answer the call while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box, and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away, and then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over and she can't move and she can't talk. And Kevin sees this happening. He runs over and he's like, Mom, what's going on? He calls 911. And as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, all she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, because her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, then he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking, and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances, because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement, and now my mom's had a stroke. So I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store, and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store, and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open, and then the door shut. And he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box, and there's writing on it. And all it says is, this has an odd darkness about it. This really freaked Kevin out, because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store, so he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. Where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist, and her head is down, and he can't tell what she's doing, and she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him, and when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse, and she raises her hands up in front of her, and then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water, and as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily. He's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real. And so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package. He eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table. And just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? This smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box. And he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen. And Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping. And so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over it, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep, and so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much, and they decide we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri, and he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box, and when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday, so he puts the package in his truck and he goes upstairs and he works for the day, and then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box, and then he gets his blacklight out and he begins scanning around the outside, and he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box, and he pops off the lock, and he gets ready, and he opens the doors, and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open, and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and it makes people sick and gives people strokes, and there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing. And his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool, but they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing, and their IT department comes up and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, but all of a sudden the Dybbuk box is in the room and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's coworkers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick, and they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly and he can't move his body. He can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye, and because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner and she looks down at him and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream. You're fine. And he's shaken up. His heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, like, that felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside, and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, what happened to you? And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the 2 previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, hey Dad, who is that? And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, you just saw that too? And he's like, yeah, who was that? And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, we have to leave the house right now. His wife comes downstairs and she's like, what's going on? And he was like, I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car. And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, okay. And they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back, it's still locked in the back of the truck, and he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in, and he was was going to put it in the basement, and it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it, because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box, after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it. And the woman reacted, and she's like, I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it. And Kevin's like, actually, yeah, I did open it. And he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues, and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this Ouija board where she had stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work, and they said the chain would go rigid, and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, release me, release me, release me. Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, they would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, and that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, what do we do? We've already opened it up. And she said, you need to contact a rabbi. And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments section and tell us where you found it. So what's the timestamp? And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, at the next solar eclipse, please give the like button a pair of cardboard flimsy children's 3D glasses and tell them with these on, you can look directly at the solar eclipse and be totally safe. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads.